Gentlemen, over to your wonderful selves, Michael and Tim.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that introduction. While I'm just trying to find the button, yeah, well, just share my screen. And you should now see the opening slide of what is a brief presentation. Just to introduce myself, and I'll let Tim briefly introduce himself. My background is actually in the oil and gas business. I worked for BG Group, British Gas, for more than 12 years in their government relations function, mainly in the Middle East, but also in Southeast Asia. And also during that time, I worked a great deal on transparency issues and was the lead on the relationship with Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, the ITI. I've been an independent consultant now for coming up for 6 years. And in that time, Tim and I have worked on a number of EITI projects, including several on beneficial ownership and beneficial ownership projects kind of outside of the ITI for the British government and in Azerbaijan. That's briefly who I am. I'll just let Tim introduce himself before we carry on.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So my name's Tim Law. My background is in the mining sector. So I spent about 12 years working for Anglo American, where I looked after all issues of tax transparency, tax stakeholder engagement and reputation and policy globally for the Anglo Group. So across Africa, Latin America and Australia and a few other places. I've also been an independent consultant now for coming up for 6 years. And as Michael says, we've worked together on a number of transparency and governance type related projects. I've also done work for a number of the FTSE 100, advising them on how to manage their reputation around tax issues and payments to government, relationships with government, and how that kind of keys into license to operate and those sorts of issues. So that's me.
So Tim and I have spent a lot of time recently thinking and researching and writing about essentially the business case with beneficial ownership transparency, how private sector companies, both in the mining sector, in the oil and gas sector, being further in other sectors as well, can actually benefit from and use beneficial ownership information for their business advantage. And this is the kind of focus of this presentation, is to kind of set out that business case. And this kind of feeds into the responsible business agenda in the sense that companies can demonstrate responsibility, not just by complying with regulations on disclosing beneficial ownership, but actively promoting beneficial ownership transparency, and then making use of public beneficial ownership information to ensure they do business with responsible companies. So avoid companies that are involved in either conflict minerals or child labor, or just have suffered problems with corruption and so forth. So the kind of 3 kind of key points for this short presentation is, for companies, this is often framed in the sense that companies are just complying with regulations and have to supply information to a register, whether it's public or not. And this is all around anti-money laundering and countering illicit finance. But actually, we look at the flip side of this. There are huge benefits for companies from using beneficial ownership, and these benefits, the public good of this information, far outweighs the modest cost of providing beneficial ownership information, either whether it's in this country or anywhere else. And having transparency around beneficial ownership of companies really is it makes a huge contribution to a more open, competitive business environment. You understand who you're doing business with, your partners, your suppliers, and any of your competitors. Avoid things like conflicts of interest and so forth. And also, companies, can demonstrate a degree of responsibility or help the situation by also actively promoting beneficial ownership, and at the end, will say a bit about how they can do that, not just in their home country, but in everywhere where they operate. Just to very briefly set out what we mean by beneficial ownership. This is a reasonably new topic on the kind of responsibility agenda, and it's only really kind of emerged in the last, I'd say, 5 or 6 years, but has a longer history. And what we mean is the people, the real human beings like you and me, who ultimately own a company, or traced back to a recognized stock exchange with robust governance regulations such as London, Toronto, New York, etc., or companies that are wholly owned, completely 100% owned by a government agency. So you don't get so much in the mining sector, but in the oil and gas sector, things like state-owned oil and gas companies. And although the term is usually beneficial ownership, it means ownership and control. So people who control companies either through appointing directors, voting rights, and so forth. That's very briefly on the definition. And at the moment, there's a whole range of sources of beneficial ownership information. There are a very limited number of public registers. There's only about 3 or 4 in existence worldwide. The UK has one and was one of the first to legislate for this and set up what they call persons of significant control register, which is part of the Companies House. And so now there's a legal obligation on every company registered in the Companies House to provide details of its beneficial ownership on registration, and also make an annual return to confirm that the information remains accurate, and to notify changes. And then if there are changes within the year, you have 14 days to notify a change. So that information is freely available. You go onto the company's website, you can search by company, as the illustration shows here, or you can search by individuals, and as well as all the other usual information you get from Companies House, like filing history and accounts and so forth. You click on that tab highlighted and you can get the persons with significant control. There are some exemptions, but that's how it works. The only other countries in the world that have anything like this are Denmark, Ukraine, and I believe Slovakia, but more are coming. All EU member states should have a public register by this year under anti-money laundering directives, and EITI has obliges implementing countries to produce this information, and several other countries are in the process of legislating or implementing this. Ghana, for example, Nigeria, amongst others. There are some private specialist providers, due diligence companies, database companies who provide this information either on a commission basis, for a fee, specifically for a specific transaction, or they produce databases of companies' owners. If you're doing business with a company, you can ask the company itself that you're acting as a supplier. And there are other, obviously, public source of information out there, open source information, press reports, and so forth. So at the moment, there's a large variety of sources. And the issue with this is that very little of it is reliable in the sense that it's verified. Even the UK register is not verified, it's self-reported. Although the UK government is introducing measures to make it more reliable and make it and verify some of the information. But companies using this information have to spend a lot of time and effort collecting information, paying for it to be collected, and verifying it. And public registers with verified information would remove some of that, but not necessarily all of that burden, and create a public good in making more of this information available. And particularly to small and medium-sized companies, and Company House research has shown that they're one of the biggest users, because small and medium-sized companies don't tend to have the resources and budgets to undertake this research for themselves or to commission third parties to do the research. And now, having gone through that kind of opening, just hand over to Tim to actually set out what the business case for beneficial ownership transparency, and about the point about promoting beneficial ownership transparency.
Thanks, Michael. So in terms of the business case, and just to explain why we're looking at this, as Michael said, we've done quite a lot of work in this area around beneficial ownership transparency, and the default position is that this has been a debate between civil society organisations and actors pushing for more transparency in ownership of companies and the elimination of kind of opacity in corporate ownership, and government agencies. And there was a bit of a gulf in interest and understanding from the private sector, and Michael and I got involved in working on a project to specifically look at this aspect of beneficial ownership, and it really kind of drew out quite how important it is and potentially beneficial it is to businesses from a pure commercial perspective. So one aspect of that is knowing who you are doing business with, and that means not just I guess the face of the business that you may actually be interacting with, in terms of whether it's your supplier or whether it's your customer who you are directly interacting with, but who is it that's actually benefiting from that business? Who is it that actually owns and controls that business ultimately? And is that person somebody who you necessarily want to be doing business with? Now there are kind of the real sharp end of that as to, you know, is this company potentially ultimately owned by somebody who is on a sanctions list, or is known to operate in an ethical manner that you wouldn't want to be associated with? Or is it simply a fact of giving yourself some more comfort that there are bona fide people behind the business, and that it has the sort of credentials that you would want to be dealing with? So it really helps businesses in understanding who they are operating with. I think out of the context of public registers of beneficial ownership, there are lots of businesses that want to know this information and pay a lot of money to find out this information already. And it's interesting that if you go back to the Global Anti-Corruption Conference in Copenhagen back in the end of 2018, it was there that BHP announced that they were producing for their own benefit a register of the ultimate beneficial owners of every company in their supply chain. So that's about 16,000 companies. And this was a register just for their own benefit, because they saw the commercial advantage of understanding who was ultimately behind these businesses. But that they had to generate through a lot of their own, or are generating no doubt through a lot of their own work, and also probably paying people to research and understand that. What we're talking about here is having a readily accessible register so that every business can get that same benefit that BHP clearly sees from doing all that work. And it also contributes to a more open business environment, in that if you are looking to enter a market or operate in a market, you can actually see who the different major players are within a particular sector. You can understand where there may be a concentration of influence if multiple companies actually are ultimately beneficially owned through the same route. That may suggest that you know, the environment for operating in that particular sector is a bit more challenging. It can also contribute to a level playing field for procurement. You know, it's clearly of great interest if the beneficial owner of a company against whom you may be competing for a particular contract turns out to be somebody who has some particular influence, or maybe directly linked to the company or even government agency that might be doing the procurement. So it opens up an awful lot of boxes that may otherwise be closed in terms of understanding that procurement happens on an equal footing, I suppose, for all businesses. It helps you to understand the risks in your supply chain, so that could be around potential risks of conflict of interest in your supply chain, or, as I mentioned already, sanctions, or simply that there is a particular political risk associated with a particular part of your supply chain because the ownership sits in a jurisdiction where you may not have readily chosen to do business, but actually you find that inadvertently you might be doing business in that jurisdiction or effectively with that jurisdiction. And I've kind of already mentioned the last one, which is around conflicts of interest and corruption and fraud and other crimes. It helps businesses to do what in a lot of cases they're having to do anyway, which is understand who their customers are and understand the financial transactions they're engaging in order to be comfortable that they're not facilitating corruption, fraud, money laundering, financing of terrorism and all these other illicit financial flows, that it's far too easy for legitimate businesses to end up associated with. So there's a really good business case for understanding who the ultimate beneficial owners of businesses are, and therefore as a consequence of that, there's a really good business case for there being public registers, because what that does is just make that whole process that much easier for businesses. And if we can ping on to the last slide, Michael. Thank you. So just very briefly, because I appreciate we're running out of time, what is it that businesses could be doing here proactively? Well, the first thing is clearly, and responsible businesses will already be doing this, complying with legal requirements to provide beneficial ownership where one exists. And as Michael has said, there are a number of jurisdictions that currently have public registers. There are also a number of other jurisdictions that have registers that aren't in the public domain, but in the first instance, complying with legal requirements. But what else can businesses do? Well, they can make a public statement of support of beneficial ownership transparency. Lots of businesses in the extractive sector are very familiar with making statements that they support the principles of transparency and they support the principles of good governance and all these sorts of almost stock phrases now. Expanding that to say that businesses support beneficial ownership transparency is an important step in galvanizing that private sector support. Businesses could also advocate for public beneficial ownership registers in countries where they operate. There's a real misconception in some government circles that the private sector is vehemently against transparency and beneficial ownership. And that's partly born out of the fact that some of the narrative has just been around compliance burden and too little of the narrative has been around commercial opportunity. And so I think there is something that businesses can do to try and alleviate that. Businesses can also support beneficial ownership transparency by demanding this sort of information from their business partners, and also to the extent that they identify discrepancies in information that's being reported under different platforms, to actually highlight that and show the consequences of misreporting and misunderstanding who you're doing business with. So I appreciate we've taken up most of the allotted time there, Sarah, but very happy to take any questions that anybody may have on either the concept of beneficial ownership or the business case for public registers.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Tim and Michael. And whilst you may have utilised your time slot to the max, you've also been answering questions behind the scenes. So thank you, Michael, for answering some of those questions whilst Tim was talking. But if I may sneak one little question or comment perhaps to you that has been coming through here on the chat. And this comes from Ludovine, and she's saying that what she finds very interesting about this is that it makes the case for more transparency in countries where we work, where perhaps this information is non-existent. And as companies, we run a huge risk of contracting with people we should not, i.e. potential corruption. Also then building on that, there's perhaps that the clash with the requirement for quotas for, e.g. local procurements, where there may be question marks around who is benefiting from the ownership of those companies versus going to more broader procurement where perhaps companies actually are a bit cleaner with regards to the beneficial ownership. Do you have any comments with regards to that, Tim or Michael?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. I mean, companies are, see the need for this information, and actually local content or quotas for particular types of companies to be involved in procurement are one area where beneficial ownership absolutely helps. So as part of, before lockdown, I was in Kenya holding a workshop on this topic, and one of the issues that came up there is that there are regulations in public procurement for companies owned by vulnerable groups, disadvantaged groups, to get preference in public procurement. The problem is that people set up front companies that look as though they're owned by a vulnerable person, somebody who's maybe disabled or something else, but actually the ultimate ownership is just a politician or somebody who has no right to make use of that quota. And so beneficial ownership in that sense absolutely helps identify that the people who are trying to take advantage of either local content requirements or some other requirement are actually genuine and not, just fronts for somebody trying to take advantage. So there are all kinds of uses for this information here, as I say, to keep, to help promote kind of open and transparent and equitable procurement process and supply chains.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much for that, Michael. I think as well, a massive thank you to both yourself and to Tim for bringing, as per usual, a different slant to the discussion actually that we've had for much of this morning, because this is an aspect where often people, they know about it, but they don't perhaps understand it in the level of detail that you guys certainly do. So thank you very, very much.